Hello, welcome to the fifth and final study in the book of Jonah. It's been a real joy and challenge for me preparing these studies and delivering them. I hope it's been a real blessing to you. I've enjoyed it a lot. I can't believe it's already coming to a close. Thankfully, we still have this lesson ahead of us today. Last week, we looked at Jonah chapter 3. We saw that Jonah finally does go to Nineveh, preaches this 8-word, depending on your translation, 8-word message, 5 words in Hebrew, to the people of Nineveh, going all throughout the city, sharing that message. And then we see Nineveh has this very intense response that's widespread throughout the city, motivated by the leadership in the city with these outward signs of sorrow. And we discussed that this was most likely genuine revival. And we saw in verse 10 that God accepted their repentance and relented from his disaster. Then we briefly dipped into chapter 4, the first verses of it, to see how Jonah would respond to God relenting from the disaster. Didn't respond well. We're going to cover those verses again briefly in our introduction, and then continue through the end of the book here in chapter 4 today. So let's dig in. All right. The verses that we covered last week, Jonah 4, 1 through, we covered through 3 last week. We're going to add verse 4 here. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, talking about how God relented from the disaster. And he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live." And the Lord said, "Do you do well to be angry?" So I love these verses. We see probably the most potent statement on God's character in the book of Jonah in verse 2, when Jonah is acknowledging that he is a gracious and merciful God who's slow to anger, abounding in love. And we see Jonah's response. Jonah gets very, very angry. It is exceedingly displeasing to him. Emphasis on that. And so Jonah essentially is throwing a tantrum. Jonah probably is looking like this baby, saying, "I'm angry." That's obviously speculation, but Jonah nonetheless is kind of throwing a temper tantrum here. We looked last week at how he really wanted this grace for himself. He was more than willing to accept it when God delivered him from the belly of the fish, for instance. But he was not willing for God to be God toward the people of Nineveh. He wanted harsh judgment toward them. We see God relents from his anger, from his wrath towards Nineveh. And Jonah thinks somebody's got to be angry, so I'm going to be angry if God's not. God is angered by sin. He has wrath towards sin out of his justice, out of his perfect holy character. Jonah doesn't need to be angry for him. We don't need to be angry at sin for God. Can we be angry at sin with God? Absolutely. But if we find ourselves angry about things that God is not angry about, then we've got an improper balance. Jonah's frustration with God over his relenting from disaster is a direct challenge on the justice of God. Jonah's saying, "No, no, no, you can't just relent from your disaster on them. They've been a wicked people, and you have to judge them." So Jonah has this overemphasis on the judgment of God towards wickedness, which is ironic because that would not have good implications for him. He would have been toast a long time ago. But here in this case, he's saying, no, you need to be strict on your justice in this scenario. But with me, yeah, go ahead and be gracious. So Jonah has a wrong idea on the balance between God's justice and his mercy and his love. And God is going to expose that throughout the rest of this book. Jumping into the next verses, 4 through 6. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. So Jonah is going out of the city, sitting to the east of the city. Given where we know the city of Nineveh was, this means he's going uphill to find a place where he would be probably safe should the city be destroyed with fire and brimstone. And he's going to try to watch the fireworks from up there. He's there waiting for judgment. These 40 days that had been proclaimed, yet 40 days and the city will be judged. The 40 days had not been finished. God had relented from the disaster, but Jonah was still hoping to see some fireworks. So he's sitting there watching outside of the city, hoping that God will change his mind again. Jonah should not have been there, by the way, if he accepted what God had said when he was relenting from disaster. Jonah would have realized there's not going to be a fireworks show. So God appoints a plant. This is a really neat thing. Even when Jonah is being petty and trivial and kind of throwing a little bit of a tantrum, God still cares about his comfort. And the same is true with us. Even when his servants are petty, God cares about us. And he cares about our comfort. Jonah was not righteous in his anger. He shouldn't have been there. Yet God still was showing him grace and seeking to meet his needs. Now, this plant was potentially probably a castor oil plant. They grow quickly in warm climates, but given the plant rising as fast as it did overnight, its growth is miraculous. So it doesn't necessarily matter what kind of plant it was. We can speculate, but the growth of this plant was divine. It was God appointed the plant to grow and ordain how quickly it would grow. And we can take from this the principle that God does sometimes appoint circumstances for our comfort, even if it seems like a little thing in life, even if it seems coincidental. God does like to bless even when we're being trivial, and he does appoint sometimes circumstances for our comfort. So Jonah has been exceedingly angry, upset about God relenting from disaster. Now Jonah is exceedingly glad. He's swung from emotional extreme to emotional extreme. And once again, Jonah is very thankful to receive the grace of God for himself, and yet is unwilling to see it shown to the people of Nineveh. So Jonah's chilling under a plant. He's in the shade, getting ready to watch his fireworks show. Jonah 4:7-8. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. And he asked that he might die and said, "It is better for me to die than to live. So there's three things that God appoints in these verses. He appoints the plant to grow and give comfort for Jonah, but he also appoints a worm. God appointed a worm, and then God appointed a scorching east wind that would beat down on Jonah. Yes, God appoints things that will bring comfort to us in our circumstances, but he is also a God who appoints the worms, so to speak, of our lives. Why is that? Well, I believe it's clear in Scripture that our comfort is not God's highest priority for us. That may sound off, it may sound strange, but it's true. Our comfort is not his highest priority. God took away comfort that he had previously given to Jonah. He never had to give Jonah that plant, but he did, and then he took it away, which he is perfectly justified in doing. And then God appointed a scorching east wind that would bring extra discomfort to Jonah. So God, yes, God cares about our comfort, but he has higher priorities than the comfort. Our character is more important than our happiness, for instance. And so because of that, God will allow, or even in this case, appoint certain difficulties, certain challenges, trials to test us, to grow us, or to teach us various lessons in our lives, because those things will bring growth and a character that is Christ-like, and that's his highest priority for us. So God's going to use these appointments of the plant and the worms and the wind to teach Jonah. They're sort of an object lesson for Jonah. Though he'd been exceedingly glad about the plant God sent, now Jonah is allowed to sink so low as to believe it was better for him to die than to live. Jonah is on this emotional roller coaster ride. He's very angry because God relented from the disaster. Then he's super happy because God sent him a plant and he feels comfortable for a little while. And then he, upon losing the plant and feeling that sultry wind, now he's thinking that it would be better for him to die than to live. And God allowed him to be in an emotional state like that. Jonah encountered a situation that didn't go according to his plan, and he had a choice in how he would respond. And we do too. Often in our lives, our plan, our idea of what we want and how we want circumstances to go, it does not always line up with God's plan or what reality is going to be. And when we face a situation like that, we have a choice in how we respond, and we have a number of options. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but I think it conveys at least the key ways that we can respond. We can run away. We can try to avoid or change God's plan. We can run from our problems. We can deny God's plan. That's what Jonah did initially in chapter 1. This is very clearly God's plan. He's calling him to Nineveh. Jonah wants nothing to do with it. He tries to run away, to escape it, perhaps even to change God's plan. Find someone else to do it, God. That obviously didn't work. You can deny God's plan and throw a fit because you can't do anything about it. In this case, Jonah didn't have the resources to destroy Nineveh by himself. He was hoping that, as God had said he would do before relenting from disaster, that he would destroy the city. There's literally nothing Jonah can do. He's just throwing a fit because he wants God to do something that he's not going to do, and there's nothing that Jonah can do about it. Kind of a somewhat related to that previous one, we can go along with it, the plan of God, the circumstances as they are, but inwardly be complaining, rebelling. Think of, you probably already have, but think of an illustration of a child. who's told to do their chores, and externally they know, I got to do this because I will be punished in this or this way if I do not. But inwardly, they're complaining, they're rebelling, and maybe even saying things like, I'm doing it because I want to, not because you told me to. Trying to be as rebellious as possible, but they're still doing it externally. And we can do that too in our lives. We can go through the motions and do the things externally that we think we're supposed to do, but inwardly our hearts are far from God. Or lastly, and obviously the best response that we can have, we can submit to his plan and with a sincere heart and trust him, accept the difference between his plan and our plan. It can be shocking when we have ideas of the way that our life or even just little circumstances are going to go, and God completely diverts those plans, changes them. That can be an incredible shock to us, but we would do well to submit to that change in our plans and recognize that God's plans are best, and that he has a purpose for everything that he does, everything that he allows to happen to us. Those are the ways that we can respond. How did Jonah respond here? Jonah was more interested in defending his own selfishness, his own prejudice. He's kind of in line with number 2 here. He's denying God's plan, throwing a fit because he can't do anything about it. God gets the last word in this book, as we're going to see here in a moment. And God decided that he would relent from disaster toward the Ninevites. And Jonah can't do anything about it, but he's unhappy with it. So he's throwing a temper tantrum. We've seen in Jonah that the book begins with the word of the Lord coming to Jonah. The story begins with God. The story will end with God. God gets the first word, and he gets the last word. This has been Jonah's last word in the book. This is the last thing that we hear from Jonah. Here in verse 9, we see the last word from Jonah, and then God uses the plant as an object lesson to challenge Jonah. But God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? And he said, yes, I do well to be angry, angry enough to die. And the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should not I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? These are the last verses in the book of Jonah. And we see this is Jonah's last word. Yes, I do well to be angry, angry enough to die. He's choosing to justify himself and to say, I am fine. This anger is righteous, and I'm so angry that I could die of anger. Obviously, this is a really intense anger that Jonah's experiencing. And this is the second time that God asks this question, do you do well to be angry? With that question, God is challenging the anger that Jonah has. Just as with the anger Jonah had towards Nineveh being spared from disaster, and with the plant, he's now angry about the plant's death. God's saying, what are you angry about? You have nothing to be angry about here. Because both of those situations were motivated out of Jonah's own selfishness. So first, God is exposing Jonah's angry. Why are you angry, Jonah? And second, God uses a very powerful comparison between the plant and the people of Nineveh to teach Jonah about God's mercy and love. So let's look at this comparison between Nineveh and the plant to get a deeper grasp on the significance of it. God points out several key differences between Nineveh and the plant. One, Jonah had not grown or cared for the plant. He didn't plant it, he didn't garden it, he didn't cultivate it. He surely didn't have a deep attachment to it. It had been there for a day or two of his life. He couldn't have been that attached to it. On the other hand, God created and loved the Ninevites in a way that's deeper than we could even comprehend. The plant's life was extremely short. But the Ninevites were human beings. They had eternal destiny. They were either going to spend an eternity with God or an eternity separated from God. The plant was small and offered a limited benefit to a small number of people. But Nineveh was a vast city made up of many people and animals. The Nineveh is so much larger in the scope. Jonah didn't have a love for the plant. It had only been around for a day. He it didn't mean that much to him, but he pitied the plant greatly. Why? Well, ultimately Jonah just wanted what the plant could do for him. And he cared about the plant more than the people of Nineveh, just because of what the plant could do for him. That's how little Jonah cared for Nineveh. At this point, he's still likely motivated by some bitterness, some hatred. It seems as though he never, at least during the time of the book, he never worked through those issues that he had with the Ninevites internally. Verse 11, when it says, those who don't know their right hand from their left, it's likely talking about children. Deuteronomy 139, the first part of the verse, says, "And as for your little ones, who you said would become a prey, and your children, who today have no knowledge of good or evil, they shall go in there." So this likely is a reference to children, and we want to note that the text says, "and also much cattle." God cares about animals too. He made animals too. He's saying, Jonah, you're throwing a fit about this plant that you have so little attachment for, so little love for. And yet there are all of these children and animals in Nineveh that have done nothing to you or anybody else. They don't know their right hand from their left. They don't know good and evil. And yet you care so much more for the fate of the plant and your own comfort than for the people of Nineveh. God cares about animals too. He made the animals too. Let's trace the justice versus the mercy of God towards Nineveh and just see what happens and see if we can learn some about God and his interactions with us. So we remember that Jonah was called to Nineveh because their evil had come up before God. So they were a wicked people, and in his justice, God needed to deal with them. Then eventually Jonah gets to Nineveh and says, "Yet 40 days, Nineveh shall be overthrown." So the people were going to be judged because their evil had come up before God. That was the response that God needed to take in light of their wickedness. Yet we see the character of God. God is a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. So God is a God of grace. So in their evil, God needs to judge the people, but this is the character of God. So when the people of Nineveh repent, God accepts that. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. So initially God had been motivated by his justice in seeking to judge the people of Nineveh. Yet he gave them grace even in the opportunity to hear the truth, to hear the message. He sent a messenger, a prophet, to tell them the truth, to tell them that they would be judged. And then at their response, he relented from the disaster. The people had still been wicked, though. How could God spare Nineveh and still live in line with his justice? Well, the answer comes from Romans chapter 8:32. God could spare Nineveh in his justice because he did mete out his justice, just not on the people of Nineveh, on his own son. Romans 8 and verse 32 says, "He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" God could spare Nineveh because he did not spare his own son. Jesus Christ took the weight, the burden, the penalty for the sin of the world. God satisfied his justice, his need to pour out wrath on his own son, so that just like Nineveh, you and I today can be spared from that destruction. We can be spared from an eternity separated from God as we respond to that sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on the cross with belief in him, with trust in him. So God, in his perfection, in his perfect character, perfectly balances his justice and his mercy towards Nineveh. The book ends with a question. Nahum and Jonah are the only books that end with a question like this, and it seems like it's kind of a weird ending. You read the book and you're waiting for something else to come, but it's like, no, that's it. There's nothing else. That's all that's there. God asks Jonah why he should not pity Nineveh, and Jonah's not given an opportunity to respond. God is effectively resting his case here, the implication being there's no reason that God should not be able to pity Nineveh. It's arrogant for Jonah even to think that he can challenge the plan of God, and God's response is, "This is my last word. Why should I not pity the people for whom I care deeply? Much more than how you care for this plant, and look how you pity the plant. How could I not pity Nineveh with my care that is so infinitely larger than the care you have for your plant?" God doesn't even give Jonah a chance to respond. He doesn't need to. Though things end on a poor note for Jonah in the book, there is a hint that he walked with God, at least later in history. So Jonah, throughout this story, has not been a good example. He's not really been a hero of the faith. He's not really been devoted to God, walking with him. He's been a very reluctant, unwilling servant, as suggests the title of this study. And yet, there's still hope for him. It's never too late, as we learned about in one of the prior studies. Jonah was most likely the author of this book. He's the most likely author. And that being the case, looking at the great deal of honesty and humility with which he wrote, the reflection on the mistakes that he made, says a great deal about where he probably was. Also, whoever was the author, if it was Jonah, he was inspired by God to write the book in this way, walking with God in doing that. God does not need to answer to anyone. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. his ways are higher than our ways. Yet on multiple occasions, he has stepped down into humanity to communicate with us, even when he doesn't have to. Here, God rests his case with a question. I think of the story of Job. Job asking God, why is this happening to me? And we assume when we see Satan approach the throne room of God and ask if he can torment Job in these ways, we assume that the book is going to answer the question, why does God allow this to happen? And yet after Job's crying out in anguish in the book, questioning God, God visits Jonah in the last chapters of the book. And he takes him on this virtual tour of the universe, saying, were you there when I made this or that? Do you know how this works? How could you balance all of these infinite interactions between people and things? How could you do that? You can't. You are not in a position to challenge the plan of God. And he kind of exposes Job, because Job thought that he was in a position to question how God was managing his life, and he was not. God never answers the question, why did he allow that to happen to Job? We never see that. So God kind of, in the same way, rests his case. He doesn't need to answer to anyone. And yet he gives just enough of a hint that we can glean from. So some application for us as we conclude today's study. Some key questions to ask ourselves. Do I value what God values? What is it that makes me angry, happy, and down? Jonah was extremely angry, then he was exceedingly happy, and then he was so down that he asked to die. He thought it would be better for him to die than to live. He gets depressed. What was it that made him angry? It was God's grace being shown toward the Ninevites. What was it that made him happy? He had some temporary comfort in the form of this plant. And what was it that made him so depressed that he wanted to die? The plant died, and there was an oppressive wind. These things are surely not in line with the values that God has. What do you treasure? What do I treasure? These are important questions to keep in mind as we seek to become like Christ and submit our desires to him. Are we valuing what he values, or are our comforts, our wishes, fleeting and superficial, like Jonah's were? Am I content even without the plants in my life? Or do I love and seek them because I like how they make me feel? God doesn't have to give us the plants. He didn't have to give Jonah the plant, but Jonah loved the plant for what it did for him. Are we content even without the plants? Or our lives, are the decisions and actions of our lives motivated out of our pursuit of comfort and things that will make us feel good? How do I choose to respond when circumstances don't go according to my plan? I say my in that question because things will always go according to God's plan, but quite often they don't go according to our plan. Do I accept the worms and the winds, so to speak? When God appoints or allows things that we don't like in our circumstances, are we accepting those things? Are we submitting to the plan of God? Are we trusting him even when we can't see where we're going? Some conclusions from this study. God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He will perfectly balance his justice and mercy according to his character, and he does not need our approval on his plan. just a summary of some themes from the book of Jonah given by Warren Wiersbe. We learn a number of things about God in the book of Jonah. In chapter 1, we see the providence and the patience of God, particularly toward Jonah. In chapter 2, we see the pardon of God, which we sort of see in chapter 3 again, but especially in chapter 3, we see the power of God. And in chapter 4, we see the pity or the compassion, the care of God. Key takeaways from the study at large, now reflecting not only on chapter 4 that we've covered today, but all 5 of the lessons that we've had. God can and will work according to his plan, even through unwilling instruments. God is sovereign and all-powerful, and his plan will be accomplished. God is gracious and ready to accept both the erring believer and most wretched unbeliever upon their repentance before him. As we come before God with a humble, with a broken and contrite heart, God is gracious and ready to accept, ready to forgive. He would far rather forgive than judge. That is the character, the nature of God. God loves us more deeply than we could ever understand. He orchestrates circumstances in such a way as to provide the best for each of us through our interaction. We saw that God was working for Jonah's best, teaching him, growing him, disciplining him for the best good of Jonah, even as he interacted with the mariners and the Ninevites. And we saw that though Jonah's mistakes and disobedience had consequences for the mariners, God worked for their best good out of that situation. And we saw that even through Jonah's reluctance, and even through the fact that Jonah was probably just going through the motions externally as he shared the message in Nineveh, God still worked for the best of the people of Nineveh. He's always working for the best in all of the complex, infinite interactions that take place in this world. Note that each of these points begins with God. The study is about God. We can glean much about ourselves. We can see ourselves in Jonah as we've been going through. It's been really easy to say, wow, Jonah, you really screwed that up. You really screwed this one. You really messed that up. Very easy to say. And we've given Jonah kind of a hard time. But let's be honest. How often do we do the very same things and perhaps even worse? Jonah had very real, strong reasons why he didn't want to go to Nineveh. And yet we often disobey God with far less powerful of reasoning. We are not really in a position to give Jonah such a hard time. But we can learn from the mistakes of Jonah. We can try not to make those mistakes, and we can learn how that the way that God handled Jonah in those mistakes, as he made those mistakes, is the same way that he deals with us oftentimes. We can learn to go back to him, to be willing instruments first and foremost, but that when we do make mistakes, when we do sin, when we're out of fellowship with him, that he's ready and willing to accept us back as we humble ourselves before him and return to him. The story is not about the fish. It's not about Jonah. It's not about the mariners. It's not even about Nineveh. All of those things are involved, and we learn great lessons from them. But the story is ultimately about God and his plan and his love and his grace. Thank you so much for joining me in this study of Jonah. It has been a tremendous pleasure for me, and I hope that, again, it's been a great blessing for you. Let's take the things that we learned, the things that we were challenged by in this study, and move forward seeking to apply them to our lives and continue to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. Take care.